Good evening, everybody. If you have your Bibles with you, I would encourage you to open to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, and that's where we're going to begin this evening. In this series that we're doing, the main focus is not that we might be successful. The main purpose of this sermon series is not that we might gain wealth, but it is that we might be able to reach our full potential. And I don't necessarily mean that to be something physical. God is first and foremost concerned about our spiritual well-being. That's my chief concern as well. But God has given us principles through His Word because He's designed us, He created us. He left us principles that will help us to reach that full potential in every aspect of our life. So though that's not our main goal, there are some areas through this study that we will look at that will touch on the physical, the practical. And I think that that's proper. For after all, we are both spirit and body. So God is concerned about the whole of who we are. Last week, we began to look at the concept of our life. And what are we going to base our life upon? What's our foundation? Are we founding our life upon God? Or are we founding it upon something else? I think after last week's lesson, I hope we are more than convinced that at least the Bible tells us that we are to base our life upon God and God alone. And everything else is shifting sand. Everything else is suspect. Everything else will disappear. Wealth, finances, popularity, power, all those things will vanish. So when it comes down to it, God and God alone is what we should base our life upon. Now, I hope you did the homework the last couple weeks. I hope you've been spending time with God, pursuing Him throughout the week. And I hope that this last week that you took some time to take stock of your own life and decided, okay, what have I been basing my life on? Is it upon God or is it upon something else? Have I been saying it's God but then living differently? And if I haven't been basing my life upon God, what do I need to do in order to bring that and change that? How do I bring my life in submission to and in subjection to God? What does that look like? And if you're still wrestling with that, if you have questions about that, I want you to know that you can come to me. I know you can come to the elders, maybe somebody else who's spiritually minded that you trust, who can help you practically figure out, okay, how do I transplant this life that I built onto a solid foundation in God? We move on this evening from our foundation, and we not so much start building as maybe laying the mortar of life, and that is time management. Now I want to do a quick disclaimer at the beginning. I am not an expert in time management. I'm not sure I would go as far as to say I'm a poor time manager, but I'm definitely not good at it. But because I'm in ministry and have been since basically I left high school, I'm responsible by and large for my own schedule. So I'm responsible to make sure that I'm managing my time. So I have a lot of experience. I don't know that I've mastered it in any way, shape, or form, but I have to do it on a weekly basis. I have to get myself to the office. I have to make sure everything gets done. So I speak as one who is trying and probably definitely not there. All right, but this is an important area. Now, time management, timeliness is not next to godliness. It's not a foundation in life. And if we look at this man-made, my-made model of life, as we look at the abstract of our life and how we build our life, we can take time management out of the equation, but and the pyramid still stands. But it's going to be a whole lot harder to accomplish everything in life. This area of time management affects everything in our life. I thought about it this week, and maybe mortar, like I said, would be a better terminology for it. You know, if it's too thick in spots, it's not going to be level. It's going to cause problems in the structure. If it's too thin, maybe it's not going to hold things together. Maybe that analogy helps you. Maybe it doesn't. You can think about oil, well-oiled machine. All of those areas, we're just trying to put something tangible on the abstract to help it make sense to us. And I hope that through this, it does. So time management is what we're going to be looking at this evening. Time is one of those interesting things. It's the great equalizer. We all have 24 hours in a day. We all have those 24 hours to do with, and we get to decide how we spend those. Now, some of us may have to work longer and harder to put the same amount of food on the table during that 24-hour period, but we're all given the same 24-hour period. Now, if I got to sit down with you and talk with you, and we started talking about your dreams and your desires and your plans for the future, I can almost guarantee that you would say this to me, because it's something I would say. I wish I could do this, but I just don't have time. And maybe that's true. I mean, we only have 24 hours in a day, so there's only so much that can be done. But we live in a fast-paced society, a high-paced society. And this area of time management is one that I think that not only God speaks to, but it's an area that we need to take note of so that we can do all the things that we are being called to do. When it comes to the spiritual disciplines by nature are things we do. So basically, I'm asking you in an already busy life to give me more of your time. So I'm challenging you in that way. So I think it's only fair that I also help you in this area of time management. Let's go ahead and let's look at our first passage this evening in Ephesians chapter 5. In Ephesians chapter 5, we're going to start our reading in verse 15. Paul says this. He says, "Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil, so that you may not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." So Paul starts off and he says, I want you to be aware that we live in evil times. We live in a day and age where sin is readily available. We can almost just reach out and touch it. It's just that easily accessible today. And it's always been that way, but I think it's especially true today. But a lot of times what we like to focus on when it comes to sin is we like to focus on the don'ts. Don't do this, don't do that. If you do this, it's sin. If you don't do that, well, we don't mess with that one as much. If we don't do something, we don't talk about how that can be a sin because it's harder to pin down. It's harder to pin down that it's a sin to drive by somebody broken down on the side of the road when you have the tools in the car and maybe the time, but you just don't feel like it. Right? Is that really a sin? Is it not? Those things that are in action, God is calling us to do, are a whole lot harder to pin down. And in a fast-paced society like today, it's a whole lot easier to be distracted. It's a whole lot easier to just be consumed with, I have this to do and that to do, and I have all these to-do lists, and I have all these apps that are telling me I need to go here and there, and we can miss those things. So Paul says, be aware that we live in a time that is sinful. And I think that's especially true today. And with our fast-paced society, we need to be careful that we're not wasting time or being distracted by things that may be good but aren't best. Right? It might be okay, and it might not be a bad thing to spend time looking on YouTube or watching Netflix or watching TV or watching the news. Those might not be bad things, but are those the best things? Are there better things that you could be spending your time with? So those are some of the things that we have to wrestle with, and I can't necessarily give you all the answers in this. The Proverbs, Solomon through the Proverbs tells us all sorts of things in this area. And in Proverbs chapter 6, starting in verse 4, Solomon says this, "Give no sleep to your eyes, no slumber to your eyelids. Deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hunter's hand, and like a bird from the hand of the fowler. Go to the ant, you sluggard. Observe her ways, and be wise. Watch, having no chief, no officer or ruler, prepares her food in the summer, and gathers her provisions in the harvest. How long will you lie down, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of your hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a vagabond, and your need like an armed man." When I was in high school, I worked for an elder of the church doing pivot irrigation work. And he always liked to quote these kind of things to me. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a thief in the night. He'd always tell me, you need to go and study work in the Bible. Go and study how much the Bible talks about work, and then go look at how the Bible talks about rest. Now, I never did that. I should have done that. I always should have done that. but I never did. But his point was well taken. Long car rides, no radio. The radio worked. He just never turned it on. And he would always talk to me about, you need to be a hard worker, and he'd explain to me all sorts of things, and I'm grateful for that. But I think there's something that we need to understand about this. When Solomon says a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, he's not completely saying you should never sleep. Some of our ladies, they'll look at Proverbs 31, and they'll say, well, this lady never sleeps. I don't know how she does it, but I'm running on fumes. And I think there's something that we need to wrestle with here. There's a difference, I believe, as we look at this concept between laziness and rest. There's a difference between being lazy and just resting. And I want us to look at the difference between those two things this evening. If we turn over to Proverbs chapter 20, starting in just verse 13, Solomon says this. He says, "Do not love sleep, or you will become poor. Open your eyes, and you will be satisfied with food." Very much like the issue of money, sleep in and of itself is not a bad thing. But like money, the love of money is the root of all evil, and the love of sleep, one could say, is the root of poverty. What Solomon is warning us against is not rest. We need rest, but we don't need to love sleep. There's a difference between those two things. It's important that we take time to rest, to recoup. But it's also important that we take time to, it's important that we not just become lazy, that we not just become lackadaisical about our lives. In 2017 and 2018, 2017, the Greensburg tornado came through the area of Kansas I lived in. And that open ground where it missed a bunch of area, that was pivot irrigation that was just tossed like rag dolls. And the following year, in 2018, we had worse tornadoes over a larger area. So we had people in the Kansas area that were working 24/7 to put together pivots and take down pivots so that the farmers had water on the crops. And it would have been very easy for my boss to have said, you know what, Michael, Sunday afternoon, we're back out in the field. As soon as church is over, grab something to eat on the way. We're way behind. And they were just stressed to the hilt. But my boss understood something about this concept of rest. He knew that if he would give us one day off and let us recoup, let us rest, that we would be ready to actually tackle the job on Monday. I want us to look at this concept of rest for a moment. In Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 1, God says this, "Thus the heavens and the earth were complete, and all their hosts. By the seventh day God completed his works, which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from which his works he had done. And he blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his works that he had from which he had created and made." So God, on the seventh day, he sanctified, or he made holy this seventh day. So God worked for 6 days straight. And I think it says something about the creation that God did. That after 6 days of laboring over creation, he was tired. The creator of the universe, the God of the universe, this amazing, wonderful Elohim Yahweh, was exhausted by the seventh day. And upon that seventh day, he then rested. And if we turned over to Exodus chapter 20, God is giving Moses the 10 Commandments, the foundation of the law. And the fourth commandment starts in verse 8. And he says, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, and you shall do all your work. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, or your sons or your daughters, or your male or female servants, or your cattle, or the sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day, and He made it holy. So God clearly teaches the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, that they need to take time to rest. So much so that He said that every seventh year the land needs to rest. And every seventh, the whole year you need to rest. So this concept of rest was built into the fabric of the Jewish nation. Now, the people of Israel took this to an extreme. They said you can only walk so far. And they laid it out in such a way where it became a burden upon the man. And the Sabbath wasn't a blessing. It was supposed to be a day of worship. It was supposed to be a day spent with family, not doing to-do lists, not doing chores. It was supposed to be a day where you thought about God, you spent time with your family, and you rested, and you were able to recharge. And the people of Israel had turned it into this legal requirement. If we turn over to the book of Luke, Jesus speaks to this, starting in verse 1. He says, "And it happened that he was passing through some of the grain fields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples were picking some heads of grain, and rubbing them in their hands and eating the grain. But some of the Pharisees said, 'Why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' Jesus answered them, 'Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone except the priest to eat alone, and gave it to his companions? And he said to them, The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath.' On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching there. As he was teaching, there was a man whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath day, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew that they were thinking, and he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Get up here, come forward.' And he got up in front of them all. Jesus said to them, 'I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath day, to save a life or to destroy it?' After looking around at them, he said, 'Stretch out your hand.' And he did so, and it was restored. But they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus." So when Jesus addressed this issue of the Sabbath day, he says, and over and over and over again in Scripture, he confronts this concept of the Sabbath that the Jews had. He said, the man is not meant for the Sabbath. It's not supposed to be a burden upon the man, but the Sabbath was meant for man so that man might be able to rest and to be restored so that they might go out and work. So we need to balance these two things between the concept of rest and work. We have to balance these two things. We can't go and go and go and go and not expect that it will catch up to us. I heard a story about an old woodcutter. He came out to the log base camp. He had his own axe. He said, "I'll fall logs for you guys all day." He's like, "Well, let's see it." So the guy went out the first day and kind of proved himself, and he cut down like 100 trees. And they were just amazed. He's like, "Wow, that's amazing." He said, "You're hired." And by the end of the week, he was barely getting one down. The foreman came to him and he's like, "What's going on?" He said, "Well, I don't know. I'm putting forth the same amount of effort." He said, "Well, how's your sharpening?" "Sharpening? I haven't sharpened my axe." See, the problem was the guy had worked and worked and worked and worked, and he never took time to stop, to sharpen his tools, and to be able to go back at the job with fresh eyes. So it's important that we balance these two things. Solomon's not done, though, giving us wisdom in this area of time management and rest and all of these things. Turn over to Proverbs chapter 21. In verse 5, Solomon says this to us: "The plans of the diligent lead assuredly to advantage, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty." We need to be intentional in our lives. If we are hasty in how we do things, if we just run off the cuff all the time, if we're constantly putting out fires, we're never going to get ahead. We have to take some time to plan out how we're going to do things. If we don't plan ahead a little bit, Now, we don't have to be one of those A-type personalities that plan everything out to the nth degree. I'm not saying that. Not everybody's like that. Not everything can work like that. I was in youth ministry. Nothing goes right. You plan. Here's how planning goes in youth ministry, all right? You plan. You then take the plan. You crush the plan. You throw the plan away, and then you go with it. That's how youth ministry goes, right? Sometimes the plan doesn't work. That's all right. But don't fail to plan. And then if you fail to plan, you will plan to fail, right? That's basically how that works. So we need to be constantly planning and at least having an idea of where we are going, or we're never going to get anywhere. In case we haven't figured it out yet, in Proverbs chapter 24, Solomon sums all of this up. In verse 30, he says, I passed by the field of the sluggard, by the vineyard of the man who lacks sense. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles. Its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. When I saw it, I reflected upon it, and I looked, and I received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. And poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. So Solomon's point, I think, is quite clear. If we sleep, if we don't rest, if we don't plan, we won't succeed. But with a little bit of rest, if we hold love of sleep at arm's length, and we plan as best we can get where we want to go, and we can succeed in what we are planning on doing. Jesus gives us one last piece of advice in this area, and if we look at Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33, he says, But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well. So the last thing that we need to think about as we look at this concept of time management is our priorities. We need to have our priorities straight. We need to seek first that which is important, and everything else will follow. So that's time management. At least that's my attempt at explaining time management. There's books that have been written. There's seminars that have been given. I barely begun to scratch the surface, and yet I've probably gone too long. Anyway, let me see if I can give you one more analogy to bring everything home. A professor stood up in front of his class one day and set a jar on the table. He says, I want to teach you something. This is going to represent your life. He then took out another container and he began to put large rocks in the jar until the jar was filled. He then asked his class, is the jar filled? Everyone was like, yeah, the jar's filled. He then took out another container full of pebbles and began to pour the pebbles into the jar. And the pebbles worked their way between the large rocks and the side of the jar. He then asked his class, which hesitantly said, yes, the jar is now full. He then reached underneath his desk once more and pulled out a container of sand and began to pour the sand and shake the jar until the sand had filled the cracks between the rocks and the pebbles. The class was now sure, yes, the jar is filled. He then reaches over, grabs his cup of coffee, and pours the coffee into the jar until it overflows. Now the class is sure. The jar is filled. There's nothing more that can fit in the jar. The wise professor now says, okay, what's the lesson here? One wise student raises his hand and says, well, obviously this teaches us that we have more time than we thought we had. He said, no, that's not the point. The point of this is that we have to have our priorities straight. We have to put what's most important first, put what is necessary next, put what we want in last, and remember there's always time for a cup of coffee with those important. The question is, how will we fill our jar? Life will pull all sorts of things at us. We have to decide how we will fill our jar. How will we use our time? We're all given the same amount of time. Now, we may have different requirements upon our time. We might have more large rocks that we have to try to shove into the jar, and the jar won't allow it. We'll get into how to keep the jar from breaking and getting all the large rocks in next week. But it's important that we remember that we have to have our priorities straight. So let's look at how we might actually apply this issue of time management to our life. The first thing is priorities. We have to have our priorities straight. And that comes straight from our foundation, upon whom we build our lives. God will dictate what our priorities are. For me personally, God is first. All my requirements between me and God, my relationship with Him, that's number one. What comes next is my relationship with my wife, and then my family, and then my job. And that's kind of how I organize my priorities. Now, you might have a little bit different thing, but I hope that God is the top priority in your life. The next thing that I would encourage you to consider is not only your priorities and what you put first and what you put second and how you arrange things in your life. A practical step is maybe getting a day planner, getting a journal, and begin to record where you're spending your time. Am I spending too much time on Facebook? Am I spending too much time in front of the computer? Am I spending too much time asleep? Am I spending too much time driving? Where am I spending my time, and how am I using that time? Another practical example that I could give you is this. Find somebody you respect, somebody you trust, somebody you will allow to speak into your life, and invite them in as a friend to speak into your life and say, okay, here's where you need to make some changes. If you're going to maybe tell them, okay, I'm going to make these changes. You come to them, hey, I'm going to make these changes, Ron. Can you call and make sure that I actually do this and hold me accountable, right? We need people like that in our life who will help us and hold us accountable. Somebody will respect and allow to do that. Not everyone will do that. Sometimes we really push back against that. But I would encourage you to find some way to practically address this issue of time management. It's not next to godliness. You can completely disregard this aspect. This is an area of wisdom. This is not an area of thou shalt spend thy time wisely. But I think you're better off. I think you will find your life much more stress-free if you will allow yourself to try to manage your time and your responsibilities wisely. So that is my attempt at time management. Like I've been doing, I want to give you some practical steps, some homework for the road. I want to challenge you not to spend just 10 minutes, but 15. I'm going to up it this week. Intentional time with God in prayer, in reading, in meditation, in worship. I want you to pursue God intentionally for 15 to 30 minutes plus every day. I know it's hard. I'm not perfect. I haven't done this as perfectly as I would like. I'll admit it. But do your best at it. I want to challenge us to continue to reach towards this pursuit of God. I also want you to take some time this week to evaluate your time management and how you might improve that. And whatever that step might be. Investing in a journal, investing in a time management app, investing in relationships and inviting somebody to help you in this. However you do that, I encourage you to consider how you might manage your time more wisely. If there's anything that we as the body of Christ can assist you in this evening, if it has to do with time management, if it has to do with just cares of this life and the challenges of your daily life, if you're ready to put Christ on in baptism, however we as the body of Christ can assist you this evening, we invite you at this time to come forward as we stand and sing.